I made a goal for the month of June to finish all of my library books, and boy, did I. Welcome to Tingledom. Hello, my tinglings. So a few weeks back, I was talking about how I got out of my funk. And one of the things I was talking about is the goals that I set to accomplish in May. So I thought I would follow up on that by talking about one of my June goals. And one of those was to finish all of the library books that I had out. I often have lofty ambitions. Books sound so interesting to me. And then I don't read them. I'll check them out from the library and never get through reading them. So I had 6 books, which you can see right here, and I'll go through them with you, that I wanted to read in the month of June. There was one other book I had, but that one I never really planned to read. It was more visuals for videos and that sort of thing. Anyway. So I decided I was going to read all of these 6 books in the month of June, or at least finish them. Some of them I had started, but not finished. So this excludes books that I've been reading for my research. I read The Landscape of History by Lewis Gadden. I've been reading Crimes Against Nature, which is a fascinating book, and a few others. But so I'm not going to talk about those, even though those would be really interesting. I'm going to focus on the books from this goal. So I have 6 books there. We have Call of the Reed Warbler, The Bush, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, the Howard Pyle book. A pirate book. I can't remember what it is, but it's a history. The Blind Assassin, and I think the 5th Artemis Fowl book. So I'm going to go through those books with you. Now, so only 2 of them. Yes, okay. So only The Blind Assassin and Artemis Fowl are really kind of traditional novels. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood is kind of a collection of tales. There's not as much anything to be spoiled about. But so I will attempt not to give spoilers on those 2, but I'll leave them for the end as well. So if you are concerned about spoilers at all, that you can stop watching when we start talking about those. Especially The Blind Assassin. I might have a hard time not giving spoilers on that one. But anyway. So we'll start off with our non-fiction books. So the first book we'll look at that I read is Black Flags, Blue Waters, the epic history of America's most notorious pirates. And this was an interesting book. It talks about the golden age of piracy, and it's a historical account, so not any embellishment, and basically purely from historical records, and then reporting what emerged and what is factually supported, what's not, and what's unknown. So it's very, very good, and I'll probably end up doing, there's 3 different episodes in there that inspired me that I'll do videos with, but we'll end up talking about those later. But so this is by Eric J. Dolan, and I think he's done a really good job with this book. It was very good, a bit long in some parts, but when there was action, it was pretty good. So I thought it was a good mix in that way of really interesting and still quite captivating when the subject matter warranted it. So, if you like history books or pirates and you want to know about pirates in America, quite interesting. One of the interesting parts that I took out of this was how there was this shifting perspective from the colonies in America to piracy. So at first, pirates were considered, basically they would get them goods that they couldn't get elsewhere, so they were most celebrated and appreciated in that way. And then as the colonies had more to export, and rather than being the purchasers of pirated goods, they became the victims of the pirates. They had less adoration for the pirates at that stage. And it was interesting to hear about the methods that they used to really shut down piracy, and interesting to think about the lifestyle of a pirate. I'd never really connected it to gangs and mobs, like the mob and the mafia, but that was really the impression that I got in reading this, that it was that sort of skirt the law, do what you can, make your money, and you're likely gonna die young. So it's pretty interesting though. Definitely worth a read. So next we have The Call of the Reed Warbler. A New Agriculture, a New Earth. And as I was reading this, it really blew my mind and really opened my perspective. So it's by Charles Massey, who I've actually gotten in contact with. I may be meeting with him over Zoom, so that would be very exciting. But so he did his PhD basically doing lots of interviews and talks with people involved in regenerative agriculture, mainly here in Australia. And regenerative agriculture is fascinating. So particularly for me, having a conservation background with understanding ecological processes and everything, it was really interesting hearing about trying to get more of that into agricultural systems, which also is from a video that I heard from him. He was saying that 70% of the world's food is actually generated through organic, small-scale farming in the, undeveloped world, but that's 70% of the world's food, so what's developed and what's not. But anyway, that's for another time. So, but for this, one of the most interesting things was hearing about the regeneration of soil. So a big problem in Australia since invasion and colonialization has been compacting and hardening of the soils. And the primary reason I've heard for that has been because of hooves breaking up lichen crusts and making it so that it's much easier for soil to erode and also get compacted. But basically in this book, he's suggesting that in the case studies that he's seeing here, that that's not necessarily the case. That it is overgrazing, so it's the hoofed animals doing the overgrazing. But it's not actually their hooves, but the grazing regime. And so when they've moved them into these smaller paddocks of palatable feed and moving them from cell to cell, I won't go into the technical details that much, but basically it allows the earth to regenerate, and they're actually seeing soil being created in 2 and 3 years, rather than the hundreds of years that you are typically heard for what it takes to create soil. So really also because it talks about instances of people moving to regenerative agriculture, and so they're still using sheep primarily, so they're grazing sheep on the land. They might be growing crop as well, but where they're actually able to carry more sheep, but they also are improving their biodiversity. So they're seeing their birds coming back, they're seeing platypi swimming in their streams, and everything like that just sounds, magical. More like, to me, what it should be like, but also we do need that ecosystem function. You need that biodiversity. And, different ways that people have dealt with the overabundance of pest insects and that sort of thing. Interesting to me because I loved my insect courses as well. So how a balanced ecosystem makes it really hard for pests to take hold, which I did know with monocultures. It's much more likely to get a breakout in pests because their predator is much less likely to have a food source besides the pest, and so they're not really in enough number to eat up the pest if it starts going out of control. So really interesting to hear about people here in Australia making a decent living and restoring their lands and regenerating. And it really got me thinking, because I guess a lot of my perspective on conservation has come from public land conservation in national parks and the like. And so to think about doing more conservation integrated with agriculture really got my brain thinking, but that'll probably be down the road research. But anyway, I'm really excited. It's a very interesting book. I highly recommend it to anyone who has an interest in farming, gardening, conservation, everything. It's a very, very fascinating book. So next we'll talk about The Bush by Dawn Watson. And I'm just going to come out with this. This was the least favorite book of the books that I read. It got a lot of really interesting information. It's a very meandering story about what the bush is basically in Australia. It's a huge part of the identity here. And so he talks about a lot of history, a lot of stories, reports, and he does include indigenous perspectives. He has some respect for Aboriginal people, but probably not as much as I would wish. I should have said in Call of the Reed Warbler, he's trying to adopt some indigenous fire practices on his land as well, so of course I liked that as well. But so this Dawn Watson book, I think there was a lot of very interesting information, but it lacked an overall structure, so I didn't really know why he was telling me this particular thing at this particular time. It just kind of felt like this random assortment of facts. So, yeah. It was interesting, and there's definitely things that I'll remember from it. Not pulling them up right now. Things are very interesting, but overall, the lack of structure made it really hard to follow. So that's The Bush, but we'll just skip past it. Now we'll move on to our fiction. We'll start with The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. Now, I'm really confused about this book because it has a copyright in it, but this was published in the late 1800s, I think, is when it was Howard Pyle died in 1911, so it was definitely before then. So this was a really interesting book. This is the book I would sit and usually read a tale while I was in the bath, keeping warm in these cold Australia winters. Not that cold as winters go, but it's cold for this time of year for a northern hemisphere brained person, we'll say. So what is interesting to me, so the Merry Adventures of Robin the Hood, they have a couple mentions of Maid Marian, but otherwise it sounds like he's just running around as a bachelor his whole life. So I thought that might emerge, but it never did. So that was interesting. But so part of the reason I've been wanting to, I have an idea for a particular type of map video. And so there is one tale in here that will really suit for that. So I'm excited for that, but I'll probably read a bit more other books on Robin Hood. I do think he is an interesting figure. What I found with this book, though, so what I was going to say was, I remember the first probably 10 to 20 pages, I felt like it was just taking forever, because I'll tell you the language. In merry England, in the time of old, when good King Henry II ruled the land, there lived within the green glades of the Sherwood Forest, near Nottingham Town, a famous outlaw whose name was Robin Hood. No archer ever lived that could steal. Let's go to where they're talking. I'll hold the best of you 20 marks, quoth bold Robin, that I hit the clout at 60 rods by the good help of Our Lady fair. So it's a bit heavy in that it's very different from how we talk nowadays. And they say quoth a lot rather than said or replied or, something more modern, I guess. But what I kind of thought was the first 10 to 20 pages, I was like, okay, it'll take me a while to get through this, but it's like any language. If you get used to it, you'll feel at home with it. So by the time I got to the end of the book and there's some action happening, I didn't even really feel the kind of time language difference. I just was right there in the story. So it's definitely worth, if you start this and feel it's a bit heavy, it's definitely worth pushing on. And you will get used to the language. So I thought it was worth reading. It'd probably be a fun book for reading to maybe 9 to 10-year-olds. I mean, there are talks of drubbings and the like, so, violence in the form of hitting people with staffs, but it's a fun book. So next is Artemis Fowl, and it was The Time Paradox. And for me, if you haven't read any of the Artemis Fowl books, they're directed towards a young adult audience. They are a quick read, and they're a lot of fun. They're a fantasy with him being kind of a young criminal mastermind type thing. Kind of gives me Richie Rich vibes, even though that's not really what Richie Rich is like. But anyway, so they've got great characters, quick, snappy dialogue, quick action, a lot going on, but it's not a complex plot. It's, it all makes sense, and it's very satisfying, great, easy to read. I do like them, and this one was no different. That's why I've made it to book 5 in the series, is because they're good. So definitely recommend starting from the beginning, and if you like them, there's a lot of them. I think I still have 3 or 4 to read, so it's great. And now we have our final book, The Blind Assassin. This is by Margaret Atwood, and And so this is the first book that I've read by her, Margaret Atwood. She's the author. She's also the author of The Handmaid's Tale, which I've watched but never read. I probably will read it. So what can I say about this book before I give a spoiler warning? I really enjoyed it, and I particularly enjoyed it after I had read it. It's one that's stuck around with me for days. I've just kind of been thinking about it. It's just been in my mind. And so it does have, in the beginning, it's very slow. If you think about sitting with, maybe not your grandmother, think of your great aunt maybe, and her telling you the story of her life. It has that sort of feel about it, but it's very cleverly written, and so there's a big payoff. That's what I'll say, the big payoff. So I think it's definitely worth reading, and it's worth persisting if you're not really that into it in the beginning. It just takes a long time to lay the groundwork. So now I'll give a spoiler warning. I don't even know what I'm going to say, but I just wanted to be able to say whatever comes to my mind. So it's a story of two sisters, and so you find out in the beginning that the younger sister has committed suicide. So if that's a topic that is sensitive to you, then I wouldn't suggest reading it. And for me, it was a bit odd, I guess, because the character's name is Laura, and I do know of a Laura who committed suicide, but so most of the book, though, isn't really about that. It's just part of the narrative, so something to be aware of. But so it follows the life of this woman through a long period of time, and she's kind of old and telling you what's happened in her life, and it's got this layered narrative structure. So she's telling you the stories about her childhood and growing up and all of that, and then interspersed are articles. So you read an article about her sister committing suicide, you read an article about another person dying, and this person dying, and this person dying. And a lot of those you read quite early on, but you don't know who any of those people are. And so there's that, and then the third story is The Blind Assassin, which is a book that was published, and so little parts of that are interspersed. And it's very cleverly done. And there's a big reveal at the end, and I guess the only thing I can say about it is I saw part of it coming. I kind of was like questioning that for about halfway through the book. And then another part I was pretty sure on about 3/4 through the book. But it was like I hadn't realized that the really big reveal had gone completely over my head. And it was almost like that was a red herring reveal. And that's why I've put a spoiler warning on this. And I still don't want to spoil it too much, even though I've given a spoiler warning. But I don't want to ruin it for anybody who is interested in reading it, because it is, it's just, I was right there with the character as she experienced this revelation in her life. It was being revealed to me as well. And so I thought it was great that she was able to take me on that journey. So, yeah. Anyway, So that's The Blind Assassin. So overall, I've loved my month reading books. I've spent a lot more time reading and even listening to audiobooks rather than watching TV, and I've loved it. I barely watched any TV actually, and so it's great. So I think I probably won't try and read 6 books every month. I'm thinking maybe 3 or 4, but I'm looking forward to having much more to read. So if you have suggestions, let me know in the comments and I will definitely take them into consideration. Thank you for being with me today, my tinglings, and I will see you on another day.